In 587 BC, the Babylonians destroyed the temple and the city of Jerusalem, and they put King Zedekiah in chains, and they dragged him off to exile with the best and the brightest of the country. And when that happened, the damage was not only physical, but it was spiritual as well. Two of the most important symbols of the covenant between God and the Israelites had just been destroyed: the throne of the monarchy and the throne of God. The people felt that they had not only lost their way of life, but they also felt they had lost their assurance of God's faithfulness. Had God deserted them? Jeremiah, who had warned them that this was going to happen, doesn't take an "I told you so" attitude, but instead, Jeremiah stays with them throughout this catastrophic ordeal. He insists that God is not giving up on them, despite how things might look. Instead, he is trying to get them to realize, as he has been telling them all along, that this isn't happening because of God. It's happening because of them. They are the reason. Their idolatry and sinfulness is the reason that they are now facing God's judgment. It's not that God wanted to punish them. It is that they wouldn't stop their punishable behavior. God hadn't given up on the covenant. They had. But now that judgment has come, Jeremiah's words turned from warning to words of hope. Despite the corruption, the injustice, the idolatry, despite all of the ways that they have turned their backs on God and God's way, God's faithfulness can't be questioned. Jeremiah has a word of unexpected good news for them. God is going to bring hope where there is no hope. God is going to bring life out of death. God is going to make a way where there is no way. No longer is the law going to be engraved on 2 tablets of stone and displayed for them all to see, but for none of them to pay attention to. This new law will be written on their hearts, and it will be displayed in their lives. No longer will they know about God, they will know God. God will forgive their sins once and for all and never again remember them. What an extraordinary promise. It really is a new way for God to relate to them. They won't have to worry about remembering the law and all the rules, saying the right words, or believing the right things, because they could never get all those things right anyway. Never. Maybe this new covenant recognizes that the old way didn't work, but this one will, because it isn't going to depend on them at all. It will be all God's doing, which is great, because no matter how hard they tried, they just simply did not have the capacity to save themselves. The new covenant is not limited to human knowledge or ability or strength. And even when we know better, we often don't do the right thing. But now God says help will be there, always be there, because it will be help from within. This covenant will be written on our hearts and is so much a part of us and our lives that we won't even have to think about it or teach it to one another. We will know it because we know God. The covenant will work because it is all God's doing. Nothing will ever need to be added to it, and nothing will need to be taken away from it. It will be all that is ever needed, and it will last forever. Right in the middle of Lent and our meditations on our sinfulness and our shortcomings, the Lord sends this message of hope from Jeremiah. It is the covenant that we reenact every time we celebrate communion. Yet we still live in a time of sin and injustice, hatred, and war. Even though this new relationship is right there living inside our hearts, we can be like Old Testament characters and harden our hearts sometimes and stiffen our necks and ignore God's voice. If we don't feel God's covenant written on our hearts, that is not God's doing. It is ours. If sin seems to have a stronger foothold in the world than God's love does, that is not God's fault. Like the people in Jeremiah's day, we have to take responsibility for what we are doing. What's different for us today is how God deals with our sin and unfaithfulness. God has done everything possible to help us. Jesus' death on the cross means we don't need any other covenant, no other plan for life, even though we're not paying attention to it. All that is ever needed has been done. Our inability to do our part doesn't change or erase it. Forgiveness is here and now, if we will only seek it. We don't have the power to change the rest of the world, but we all do need to start taking responsibility for our part. Like the Israelites that Jeremiah speaks to, the day is surely coming, the day still in the future. The promise is there, but we believe in the one who has promised it. We have staked our eternal lives on it. We see the plan every Holy Week, and we celebrate its power every Easter. It is available for us right now if we will accept it, and it can change us and our lives, even if at this point we can't change the whole world too. Jeremiah's presence among the people was the continuing sign of God's presence with them, God's faithfulness to them and to the promise, despite their unfaithfulness. Jesus' presence on earth was the continuing sign of God's presence and God's faithfulness to the promise, despite sinfulness. And it is today. Instead of learning about it, God's invitation is to live it, to know it through and through, not because we have studied it or memorized it, but because it is written in our hearts, and it greets us each day, and it helps us through that day. To God be the glory forever. Amen.